Bedtime Biographies. Theodore Roosevelt. It is October 27th, 1858. Manhattan is gaslit and crowded. The Civil War still raging 300 miles south. A boy is born on East 20th Street to parents who worry he will not survive the week. His lungs betray him. Asthma seizes him in the dark. The doctors have nothing to offer but silence. Yet inside this fragile body lives something restless, something that will not be still. By 7 years old, he has seen a dead seal at market and decided the world must be studied, collected, understood. By 9, he is writing papers on insects, filling rooms with specimens and wonder. This is Theodore Roosevelt before he becomes a name. This is the boy who chose vigor over fear. What follows is a life of extremes, a man shaped by weakness who became a symbol of strength, a naturalist who would command nations, a president at 42, the youngest ever to take the oath, a trustbuster, a Peace Prize winner, an explorer who nearly died in the Amazon, a life that swept across conservation and war, across the frontier and the world stage, leaving monuments and questions in its wake. If you're listening on Bedtime Biographies tonight, find a comfortable place. Dim your lights. There is no rush here. It's perfectly fine to let yourself drift away as we follow this remarkable man from his gaslit birth to his quieter end. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Let's begin in the darkness with a boy learning to breathe. A sickly child. A sickly child, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., came into the world on October 27th, 1858, at 28 East 20th Street in Manhattan, during that peculiar season when autumn has begun its slow turn toward winter, and the city's air carries both the brightness of departing leaves and the first whisper of cold to come. His parents, Martha Stewart Bullock and Theodore Roosevelt Sr., a businessman of considerable standing, welcomed him into a household already containing an older sister, Anna, known within the family as Bammy. 2 more children would follow, Elliot, younger than Theodore, and Corinne, the youngest. It was a family of means and position, situated in the Upper East Side of New York, in that quarter where families of substance built their lives with the confidence of people for whom the world seemed largely arranged to their comfort. Yet from his earliest days, Theodore Roosevelt carried within him something that would shape every moment of his existence, every choice he would make, every transformation he would undergo. His childhood was attended by a presence more demanding than any nurse or tutor, a presence that filled his nights with terror and his days with the constant, exhausting struggle for breath. The asthma that visited him arrived without warning and without mercy, in attacks so debilitating that they frightened not only the boy himself, but his parents as well. There was no understanding of what caused these seizures, no remedy that the medical knowledge of the time could offer. Doctors had no cure. The boy would lie awake in the darkness, gasping, feeling the world narrow to nothing but the desperate need for air, while his mother and father stood helpless beside him, aware of their powerlessness before an affliction that seemed to strike at the very heart of their son's capacity to live. Yet something remarkable inhabited this sickly frame. Despite the constraints imposed upon him by his failing body, Theodore Roosevelt possessed an energy of mind and spirit that seemed to burn with almost feverish intensity. He was mischievously inquisitive, the sort of child who could not be content with passive observation, but who needed to investigate, to dissect, to understand the world through direct engagement with it. Where many children of his class might have been kept indoors, protected from exertion, Roosevelt somehow found ways to engage with the living world around him with fierce determination. The genesis of what would become a lifelong calling arrived when Theodore was 7 years old. He saw a dead seal at a market, a simple enough occurrence in a city that maintained commercial connections to the natural world, but the sight kindled something in him that would never be extinguished. He obtained the seal's head and, with the enthusiasm of childhood's most intense fixations, he and his cousins established what they named the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. This was no casual collection, but a serious enterprise, conducted with the gravity of genuine scientific ambition. Theodore taught himself the rudiments of taxidermy, that meticulous art of preserving and mounting the bodies of animals, and he populated his makeshift museum with creatures he had killed or caught. By the time he was 9 years old, he was recording his observations with careful attention in a paper he entitled The Natural History of Insects, a document that suggests a mind already learning to observe, categorize, and articulate what it perceived in the natural world. The Roosevelt family, in keeping with their station and the customs of prosperous Americans of the era, undertook journeys that broadened the horizons of their children. In 1869, when Theodore was still very young, the family traveled to Europe, returning again in 1870. These were not brief excursions, but extended tours, the sort of immersive experience in foreign lands that was intended to furnish a child with cosmopolitan perspective. 3 years later, in 1872, the family journeyed to Egypt, adding to the accumulating layers of experience that would shape the boy's understanding of the world's vastness and variety. It was during the European travels of 1869 that something crucial occurred, a discovery that would prove more consequential than any museum or collection. While hiking with his family in the Alps, Theodore Roosevelt noticed something that seemed to offer him a pathway through the darkness of his affliction. Physical exertion, the sustained effort of climbing mountain slopes, seemed to have a peculiar effect upon him. The asthma attacks diminished. His spirits lifted. The body that had felt like a prison for so much of his early life seemed, when pushed through strenuous activity, to function more reliably, to offer him more of what he sought from existence. This was not a cure, not a miraculous healing, but something perhaps more valuable, a principle, a philosophy, a way of living that might allow him to transcend, at least partially, the limitations that had been imposed upon him at birth. Roosevelt seized upon this discovery with the intensity that characterized everything he approached. He began a heavy regimen of exercise, determined to rebuild his body through sheer force of will and consistent physical exertion. This was not the modest activity of a child taking constitutional walks with his governess, but something far more ambitious and deliberate. Yet even with this new commitment to physical development, there came an encounter that revealed to him the inadequacy of exercise alone, without training and skill. On the way to a camping trip, older boys manhandled him, demonstrating the vulnerability that remained despite his growing strength. In response, Theodore sought out a boxing coach and began a systematic training in the art of combat. Here was the beginning of a pattern that would define much of his life: the identification of a weakness, the fierce refusal to accept that weakness as permanent, and the methodical, determined pursuit of mastery. The education of Theodore Roosevelt followed a path somewhat unconventional for boys of his class and era. Rather than attending one of the established preparatory schools that had been designed to sort and polish the sons of New York's elite, he was educated at home through tutoring. Such arrangements had their merits. The instruction could be tailored to a particular child's needs and abilities, but they carried risks as well. The biographer H.W. Brands would later write that the most obvious drawback was uneven coverage of various areas of knowledge. The evidence of this unevenness was apparent in the shape of Roosevelt's learning. He demonstrated solid competence in geography and revealed himself to be genuinely bright in history, biology, French, and German. Subjects that suited his particular cast of mind and his appetite for knowledge. Yet in mathematics and in the classical languages, those pillars of traditional education that had long formed the backbone of instruction for gentlemen, he struggled. He was not a child of uniform brilliance, but rather one whose mind illuminated certain paths while remaining obscured in others. In September of 1876, at the age of 17, Theodore Roosevelt entered Harvard University. His father, a man of religious conviction and firm in his beliefs about what constituted a well-ordered life, offered his son guidance as he embarked upon this new phase of his education. The instruction, though brief, carried the weight of paternal concern and wisdom earned through years of living. "Take care of your morals first," the elder Roosevelt told his son, "your health next, and finally your studies." It was a hierarchy of values that spoke volumes about what this father believed to be most essential in the formation of a young man. Theodore would carry these words with him through his years at Harvard and beyond, though he would interpret them in ways that his father, had he lived longer, might not have entirely anticipated. The university years that followed occurred under a shadow that would darken them permanently. On February 9th, 1878, Theodore's father died. The loss devastated the young man, cutting off a relationship that had been marked by admiration, affection, and the deep emotional connection that often binds a sensitive son to a father whose values and character command respect. At the time of his death, the elder Roosevelt was a man of prominence and influence, a man whose life had embodied the principles he had sought to instill in his children. The financial legacy that accompanied this personal loss was substantial. Theodore inherited $60,000, a sum equivalent to approximately $1.5 million in the currency values of a much later era, an amount upon which he could, had he chosen, have lived comfortably for the remainder of his life without engaging in any productive labor. Yet the money, though meaningful, could not compensate for the absence of the man who had given it. During his years at Harvard, Theodore Roosevelt found ways to continue the work his father had modeled. His father had been a devout Presbyterian who had regularly led his family in prayer, conducting these moments of spiritual discipline and reflection as naturally and regularly as one might conduct other essential household activities. Young Theodore, now an adult, sought to emulate this paternal example by taking on the work of teaching Sunday school. For more than 3 years, he taught at the Episcopal Christ Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, volunteering his time and energy to the religious education of young people. This was not the work of a man primarily concerned with social advancement or the accumulation of credentials, but rather the action of someone genuinely moved by a sense of moral obligation to transmit values to the next generation, much as his own father had done for him. This arrangement continued until a moment of principal difficulty arose. The minister at Christ Church insisted that Roosevelt formally convert to Episcopalianism if he wished to continue his teaching duties. Here was a test of commitment, a boundary beyond which the minister would not permit Roosevelt to go without making a formal declaration of faith. Roosevelt declined. Rather than compromise his conscience or accept a condition that felt to him to be an infringement upon his intellectual and spiritual integrity, he simply withdrew from that particular pulpit and began teaching instead in a mission class located in a poor section of Cambridge. This was characteristic of a pattern that would emerge repeatedly throughout his life, a willingness to sacrifice convenience, social position, or institutional approval when principles seemed to demand it, coupled with a determination to find alternative means of pursuing what he believed to be important work. At Harvard, Roosevelt encountered subjects that energized his mind and coursework that seemed to speak directly to his deepest interests and capacities. He did well in science, philosophy, and rhetoric, the subjects that stretched the dimensions of his intellect and connected to his way of seeing the world. Yet, the classical languages that had formed the heart of traditional education, Latin and Greek, continued to frustrate him, much as they had during his years of home tutoring. By the time he was at Harvard, he had already established himself as an accomplished naturalist and had begun publishing work in ornithology, the careful study of birds. He attacked biology with intensity, reading with an appetite that seemed almost boundless, and retaining what he read with a facility that those around him found remarkable. He seemed to possess something approaching a photographic memory, a capacity to absorb information and hold it with precision. Beyond the classroom, Roosevelt participated in rowing and boxing, both pursuits that allowed him to continue the physical development that had become central to his sense of himself and his possibilities. He joined the Alpha Delta Phi Literary Society and became a member of the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity. He gained entry to the Porcellian Club, an organization of considerable prestige whose membership was restricted to a select few. These affiliations marked him as someone capable of moving within the social hierarchies of Harvard, yet his genuine passion seemed to belong to the intellectual and physical pursuits rather than to the social maneuverings that such memberships might have implied. In 1880, Theodore Roosevelt graduated from Harvard, achieving the distinction of Phi Beta Kappa, that honor society that marks exceptional academic achievement. He ranked 22nd among 177 students in his class and was graduated magna cum laude, a significant honor. He had completed his undergraduate education. And yet there seemed to be a notable irony in his own assessment of what he had gained. Looking back at his college career and attempting to analyze its benefits, Roosevelt concluded that he had obtained relatively little of lasting value from Harvard. The formalistic treatment of so many subjects had depressed him. He had found the rigidity of the institution, its meticulous attention to details that seemed important in themselves, but which somehow never seemed to connect to the larger whole, to be constraining rather than liberating. It was an assessment that spoke to something fundamental about how Roosevelt's mind worked and what he required of an educational experience, not the careful accumulation of discrete pieces of knowledge, but rather an understanding of how those pieces fit together into a coherent vision of how the world actually functioned. Having abandoned his earlier plan to pursue advanced study in the natural sciences, Roosevelt turned his attention instead toward the law. He enrolled at Columbia Law School, moving back into his family's home in New York and settling into a new phase of his life in the city of his birth. He was an able student, his mind was quick, and his capacity for work seemed virtually inexhaustible. But the law itself seemed to him fundamentally irrational, a system of human contrivance that lacked the elegant logic he sought in his intellectual pursuits. The rules seemed arbitrary, the reasoning circular. It did not take him long to recognize that whatever his capacities might be, his true interests lay elsewhere. Even while enrolled at Columbia Law School, Roosevelt had begun attending meetings at Morton Hall, the headquarters of New York's 21st District Republican Association. This was a calculated step, the action of a young man who had decided that his future lay not in the study of jurisprudence, but in the active conduct of public affairs. His father had been a prominent member of the Republican Party, a man of standing within the political structures of New York. Yet for someone of Roosevelt's class, the educated, prosperous sons of established families, to involve oneself too directly in politics was considered somewhat unorthodox. Most of Roosevelt's peers, those with whom he had grown up and studied, maintained a certain distance from the machinery of electoral politics, viewing such involvement as somehow beneath their station or as a distraction from more refined pursuits. Roosevelt, however, had come to a different conclusion. He found allies among the local Republicans, men who recognized in him both intelligence and ambition, and he began to make his move within this new arena. His initial political effort was marked by a striking act of boldness. There was a Republican state assemblyman who had long been tied closely to the political machine controlled by Senator Roscoe Conkling, one of the most powerful figures in New York politics. This man had held his position through his connections to the machine, through the patronage that flowed from association with Conkling's power. Roosevelt challenged him directly, and Roosevelt won. It was a victory that announced to the political establishment of New York that a new force had emerged, someone who could not be ignored and who was not content to accept the existing order of things. Following this initial electoral success, Roosevelt made a decisive choice. He left Columbia Law School without completing his degree and never returned to finish the work he had begun. He had decided, with the clarity of purpose that seemed to characterize his major decisions, what his actual vocation would be. As he would later reflect, he had intended to be one of the governing class. It was not a statement of personal ambition in the narrow sense, but rather an expression of his belief that those who possessed certain capacities and advantages had an obligation to employ them in the service of public life and public good. Yet even as Roosevelt was beginning to engage with the world of politics and public affairs, he was simultaneously engaged in scholarly work that would establish his reputation in a different sphere. While he had been at Harvard and continuing into his early years in New York, he had undertaken a systematic study of the role that the United States Navy had played in the War of 1812, that conflict of the early 19th century that had tested the new nation's capacity to defend itself against a powerful adversary. In 1882, he published the product of this research under the title The Naval War of 1812. It was a work marked by genuine scholarship, by careful attention to detail, by precise comparisons of British and American leadership measured at the level of individual ships and individual commanders. The book received praise for both its scholarly rigor and its literary style, and it would endure as a standard study of that particular war, consulted by historians and naval strategists for generations to come. There was, among some observers, a question about the sources of Roosevelt's naval thinking and the ideas that animated his advocacy for American naval power. Some believed that his ideas had been derived from or heavily influenced by Alfred Thayer Mahan, an author and naval theorist who had become increasingly prominent in the 1880s and who had articulated a powerful thesis about the relationship between naval power and national influence. Mahan had popularized the concept that only nations possessing significant naval power had been able, throughout history, to influence events broadly, to dominate the oceans, to exert their diplomacy to its fullest effect, and to defend their borders effectively. It was a compelling framework, and it had influenced strategic thinking in multiple nations. Yet naval historian Nicholas Danby would later state that Roosevelt's ideas had actually predated his meeting with Mahan, or his reading of Mahan's work. Roosevelt had arrived at his convictions about naval power through his own study and analysis, independent of Mahan's influence. Though once exposed to Mahan's work, he would certainly have found in it a framework that aligned with conclusions he had already reached. Roosevelt had become convinced of the importance of naval strength through careful, methodical reasoning. His systematic study of naval history had led him to conclusions about power and national interest that aligned naturally with Mahan's framework. Even though Roosevelt had arrived at these views independently, this intellectual independence would characterize much of Roosevelt's thinking throughout his career. He was a voracious reader and synthesizer of ideas, but he came to his most deeply held convictions through his own analysis rather than wholesale adoption of another man's doctrine. The publication of The Naval War of 1812 in 1882 marked a significant moment in Roosevelt's intellectual development. The book was no mere antiquarian exercise or academic exercise divorced from contemporary concerns. Rather, it represented Roosevelt's attempt to draw lessons from history that might illuminate present-day strategic questions. His meticulous comparison of British and American naval leadership, his attention to ship-to-ship engagements and the decisions made by commanders, his analysis of how naval power had shaped the course of the war, all of this reflected a mind already engaged with questions of how nations project power and protect their interests. The reception of the book among scholars and the reading public alike established Roosevelt as something more than a wealthy dilettante with political ambitions. Here was a young man of the leisure class who had devoted serious intellectual effort to understanding a historical period of naval conflict. The book's scholarship was rigorous, its prose accessible, and its conclusions clear-eyed. That it remains a standard study of the War of 1812 speaks to the quality of Roosevelt's work. He had proven himself capable of sustained research, careful argumentation, and clear exposition, qualities that would serve him well in whatever roles he might subsequently undertake. Roosevelt's experience in the New York State Assembly from 1881 to 1884 represented his first extended engagement with practical governance, though his naval interests remained a constant thread running through his intellectual life. While he was occupied with the details of Albany politics, fighting corruption, and building his reputation as a reformer, his mind was still turning over questions about America's role in the world and the relationship between naval power and national influence. The Assembly provided him with a platform and with experience in the mechanics of legislation, but it could not contain the full range of his ambitions or interests. The Dakota years, from 1883 onward, appeared on the surface to pull Roosevelt away from political engagement and from the metropolitan centers of power. Yet even in the Dakota Territory, living as a rancher and cattleman, Roosevelt maintained his intellectual life. He wrote extensively about his experiences in the West, contributing articles to national magazines and publishing books about ranch life and hunting. These publications kept his name before the reading public and allowed him to shape his own narrative about the American frontier and its character. More importantly, they gave him time to reflect on larger questions about American identity, national character, and the qualities he believed necessary for a vigorous national life. The severe winter of 1886–1887 that destroyed his cattle herd and wiped out a substantial portion of his investment might have seemed a catastrophic failure to many men. For Roosevelt, it represented a necessary interlude that brought him back to the East and to politics with renewed vigor. The Dakota experience had given him something invaluable first-hand knowledge of the frontier, of the lives of working men, of the realities of economic life outside the drawing rooms of Manhattan. He had lived among cowboys and ranchers, had hunted and ridden and worked under harsh conditions, and had proven to himself and to others that he was more than a sickly intellectual. When he returned to New York, he did so not as a man retreating from failure, but as someone who had tested himself against the frontier and had earned the respect of those who lived there. The writing project that occupied much of his attention upon returning to New York, The Winning of the West, allowed Roosevelt to continue his historical studies while also articulating a vision of American expansion and American character. The book was not merely a recounting of westward movement, it was an interpretation of American history that emphasized vigor, national purpose, and the expansion of American influence across the continent. In some respects, it foreshadowed the imperial vision that would characterize Roosevelt's later thinking about America's role in the world. The nation that had conquered a continent, the argument seemed to suggest, was one possessed of the energy and will necessary to play a larger role on the world stage. When Roosevelt was appointed to the Civil Service Commission in 1889, he brought to that office the same reforming zeal that had characterized his work in the Assembly. The spoils system represented to him everything that was wrong with American governance, the elevation of personal and partisan advantage over the public interest, the rewarding of loyalty rather than merit, the corruption of public service into a mechanism for private gain. His battles with the Postmaster General and his insistence on enforcing civil service laws earned him a reputation for aggressive, sometimes abrasive reform. Some found him tiresome and self-righteous, but few could deny that he had made a real difference in shifting the terms of debate about how government should function. By the time Roosevelt became police commissioner of New York City in 1894, he had developed a clear philosophy about the relationship between moral purpose and effective governance. His work with Jacob Riis exposed him directly to the terrible living conditions of the city's poorest inhabitants, and it hardened his conviction that government had a responsibility to address genuine social problems. At the same time, he believed that this responsibility had to be carried out with vigor and effectiveness, not merely with good intentions. His implementation of regular inspections, physical exams, and merit-based recruitment represented an attempt to inject efficiency and professionalism into an institution rotten with corruption and patronage. The reform work in the police department also brought Roosevelt into closer contact with the complexities of urban life and urban governance. Managing a large bureaucracy, dealing with entrenched political interests, seeking to balance reform with practical politics, these experiences in New York City government gave Roosevelt education in executive responsibility that would prove invaluable when he later occupied higher office. He learned that reform required not just moral clarity, but also political skill. That confrontation often had to be tempered with pragmatism, and that the best outcomes sometimes came through compromise rather than unvarnished principle. When Roosevelt moved into the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897, he brought with him not only his long-standing intellectual conviction about the importance of naval power, but also considerable practical experience in the management of bureaucratic institutions and in navigating political complexity. The office itself, held by someone less energetic, might have been largely ceremonial. Roosevelt, however, had found in Secretary of the Navy John D. Long a superior content to delegate substantial authority to him. This circumstance, combined with Roosevelt's own determination to shape naval policy, gave him significant influence at a crucial historical moment. The attention Roosevelt gave to naval preparedness in late 1897 and early 1898 was not the expression of abstract theory, but rather the application of long-held convictions to immediate practical circumstances. He had spent years studying how nations project power, how naval strength translated into international influence, how preparedness could determine outcomes in moments of crisis. Now, with war with Spain appearing increasingly likely, Roosevelt had the opportunity to put these convictions into practice. The orders he sent to naval vessels in preparation for conflict, the backing he gave to officers like George Dewey, who shared his views on naval power, the pressure he applied to McKinley to move toward military action. All of this reflected a man who had thought deeply about these questions and believed profoundly in the righteousness of his position. Roosevelt's service as Assistant Secretary of the Navy demonstrated to him the possibilities that awaited an executive with the will to exercise power and the clarity of vision to know how to direct it. The Navy, under his influence, was being prepared for a war that he believed would benefit the nation strategically and would demonstrate to the American people the virtues of vigor and national purpose. When he resigned from the office to take command of the Rough Riders, he was stepping away from a position of influence to pursue something he valued even more highly, the opportunity to test himself in actual combat and to serve his country in a more direct and visceral way. The Rising Reformer. Chapter 2. The Rising Reformer, the machinery of politics ground forward with its own inexorable logic, indifferent to the personal exhaustion it might produce in those who operated it. Roosevelt had tasted executive power, had felt the satisfaction of marshalling men and resources toward purposes he believed just. The Assistant Secretary's position had been for him a kind of education in what government could accomplish when wielded by someone possessed of conviction and energy. Now, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a different opportunity presented itself, not the quiet work of administration from within the Navy Department's corridors, but a more public calling. The 1900 Republican National Convention approached, and with it came the question of who would serve as William McKinley's running mate in his bid for re-election. Roosevelt himself had announced publicly that he would not accept such a nomination. The very prospect appeared to confine him, to place him in a role that would offer the nominal dignity of high office without its genuine responsibilities. The position of vice president was known to be a graveyard of political ambition, a place where energetic men were sent to languish. Yet even as Roosevelt issued his refusal, the political machinery around him moved in directions he had not entirely controlled. Thomas Platt, the powerful New York Republican boss, had sought to remove Roosevelt from the governor's office, viewing him as an inconvenient reformer who refused to properly consult with the party hierarchy. Platt began to see the vice presidency not as an honor, but as a solution, a means of elevating Roosevelt to a position where his energy could be safely contained, channeled into ceremonial duties rather than genuine executive action. It was a peculiarly American political drama. The man who wished to avoid the office and the boss who wished to thrust him into it found themselves in a strange dance of negotiation. Roosevelt attended the 1900 convention as a delegate from New York, and there he struck a bargain with Platt. He would accept the nomination if the convention itself offered it to him, but otherwise he would serve another full term as governor. This careful equivocation preserved his dignity while leaving open the possibility of a different future. Platt, eager to move the troublesome young reformer aside, set about making certain that the convention would indeed offer what Roosevelt had stipulated. He enlisted Matthew Quay of Pennsylvania, a powerful figure in Republican circles, to lead the campaign for Roosevelt's nomination. Quay proved skillful in this work, outmaneuvering Mark Hanna, McKinley's own close ally, at the convention itself. When the delegates finally voted, Roosevelt won the vice presidential nomination unanimously, an apparent triumph of popularity that masked the behind-the-scenes maneuvering that had produced it. The campaign that followed revealed something essential about Roosevelt's nature, something that transcended questions of formal office or political machinery. The Democratic nominee that year was William Jennings Bryan, a man of considerable theatrical gifts, whose barnstorming style, the tireless touring, the appeals to the common people, the moral certainty of his rhetoric had already made him a formidable force in American politics. Bryan had supported the recent war with Spain, but he had turned sharply against what he termed the imperialism inherent in American annexation of the Philippines. Here was a genuine point of disagreement, a matter on which Roosevelt held deep and unshakable convictions. Roosevelt's campaign for the vice presidency proved itself a whirlwind of activity that seemed to embody the very vigor he believed the nation required. In a span that tested the endurance of traveling in an age before convenient modern transportation, he made 480 stops across 23 states. The energy he expended was not merely political calculation. It reflected something fundamental in his temperament, a hunger for direct contact with crowds, for the sense of being in motion towards something consequential. He denounced Bryan's radicalism with considerable force, but his principal argument focused on the matters of national honor and purpose. The war with Spain, as Roosevelt saw it, had revealed the capacities of the American people and the American military. To retreat from the Philippines, to abandon the islands to chaos or to European domination, would be to betray both the soldiers who had fought there and the larger purposes for which they had fought. Roosevelt's counter to Bryan's anti-imperialism was not framed in the crude language of conquest or national aggrandizement. Rather, he argued that stability and good governance were what the Filipino people required, and that American oversight provided both. American power in the world, from his perspective, was not something to be ashamed of or minimized. It was a fact to be managed wisely, a responsibility to be undertaken with the understanding that great nations carried the burden of order and civilization. To withdraw from that responsibility would be to fail not only the Filipinos, but the world itself, which required strong nations to maintain the balance that prevented worse alternatives from taking hold. The voters rendered their verdict in November 1900. McKinley and Roosevelt won decisively, and the president's victory margin proved even larger than his triumph 4 years earlier, when he had first defeated Bryan. The American electorate, in the waning weeks of the 19th century, appeared to endorse both the war with Spain and the imperial policies that had flowed from it. They appeared as well to give their approval to the younger man who had prosecuted the conflict with such enthusiasm and who now stood ready to assume the second office in the land. Roosevelt took office as vice president in March 1901, and almost immediately the peculiar torment of the position became evident. It was the most dramatic possible contrast with the executive authority he had wielded in the Navy Department, or, for that matter, in the governor's mansion. The vice president presided over the Senate, theoretically a place of consequence, yet the Senate adjourned after merely 4 days of Roosevelt's tenure in the chair. The remainder of his responsibilities amounted to little more than waiting for ceremonial occasions, waiting for the president to require consultation on matters of state, waiting in a condition of official powerlessness that chafed against every aspect of his temperament. His 6 months as vice president were, by his own lights, utterly devoid of interest. A man constitutionally incapable of remaining idle, accustomed to the satisfaction of making decisions and seeing them carried into effect, found himself in a position that offered neither purpose nor genuine authority. Yet even in this interval of enforced inactivity, his mind did not cease its work. On September 2nd, 1901, as summer gave way to autumn, Roosevelt articulated a principle that would resonate throughout his subsequent career, and that seemed to crystallize something he had long believed. In words he publicized at that moment, he declared, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far." It was a simple formulation, memorable in its cadence and its practical wisdom. Yet it contained within it a view of the world and of America's role within it that went far beyond mere proverb. The big stick represented military power, technological capacity, the material strength that great nations accumulated. But the instruction to speak softly, to avoid unnecessary bluster, to conduct diplomacy with restraint, suggested something more subtle. That true power required no excessive advertisement, that real strength could afford to be measured in its expression. This was not the swagger of a bully. It was the confidence of someone who understood that genuine authority did not require constant demonstration. The aphorism thrilled those who heard it, particularly those who shared Roosevelt's conviction that the United States must play an active role in world affairs. Here, expressed with economical precision, was an entire philosophy of international conduct. It suggested that America need not choose between idealistic isolation and crude imperial domination. It proposed instead a middle path, engagement with the world, armed and capable, but circumspect in its speech and restrained in its use of force, except where the nation's true interests required otherwise. What Roosevelt could not have known, as he uttered these words in the boredom of his empty vice-presidential days, was how soon he would be called upon to act on these principles. The machinery of history, vast and impersonal as the political apparatus he had already come to understand so well, was moving him toward a transformation as complete as any he had yet experienced. The sitting president, William McKinley, a man of sound judgment and steady purpose, seemed likely to preside over the nation's affairs for years to come. Roosevelt, it appeared, would remain in his powerless sinecure, consulted perhaps but never truly wielding influence, his energies constrained to the narrow confines of ceremonial duty. The afternoon of September 6, 1901, brought news that would alter everything. In Buffalo, at the Pan American Exposition, McKinley had been shot by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. The president was in the hospital, his condition initially appearing stable enough to permit some hope of recovery. Roosevelt, who had been vacationing on Île-la-Motte in Vermont, traveled to Buffalo to visit the stricken president. When McKinley seemed to stabilize, Roosevelt returned to his vacation, resuming the quiet country retreat that had offered him at least some respite from the frustrations of Washington. But McKinley's condition was more precarious than first believed. As word came that the president's health was deteriorating, Roosevelt rushed back to Buffalo, traveling through the night from his holiday location. He was at North Creek, somewhere in transit, when the news finally came on September 14. McKinley was dead. The president had succumbed to his wounds and to the complications that followed them. Roosevelt proceeded immediately to Buffalo, moving with the purposefulness that seemed to characterize his every action. There, at the Ansley Wilcox House, he took the oath of office and became the 26th President of the United States. He was 42 years old, the youngest man ever to assume the presidency, and one who had been summoned to it not by the ordinary mechanisms of political succession, but by the sudden rupture that violence had created. The transition shocked many in the Republican establishment. McKinley's supporters, particularly Mark Hanna of Ohio, a man of considerable influence within the party, regarded Roosevelt with undisguised unease. Hanna had opposed Roosevelt's nomination to the vice presidency in the first place, viewing him as unstable, too prone to acting without sufficient consultation. The sudden elevation of this impulsive young man to the highest office in the land troubled conservatives who valued predictability and who had grown comfortable with McKinley's steadier hand. Though Roosevelt assured party leaders that he would continue McKinley's policies and that he retained the late president's cabinet, his actions almost immediately suggested a different emphasis. What Roosevelt possessed, which McKinley had possessed in lesser measure, was a sense of himself as a leader, not merely an administrator executing the will of his party or the preferences of its kingmakers, but as someone called to reshape the political landscape according to his own vision. He had come to power unexpectedly, but he moved into that power as though he had been born to it. The question that now occupied his mind was not how to remain subordinate to the party hierarchy, but how to establish himself as the party's leader and to position himself advantageously for the 1904 election, when he would face the voters in his own right. The apprehension with which conservative Republicans regarded Roosevelt was, from their perspective, thoroughly rational. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin captured the substance of their anxiety. Conservatives, who had dominated Republican politics for 3 decades, feared that this impulsive young president would prove to be a bucking bronco, upsetting the carefully constructed alliance between business interests and government authority that had, in their view, delivered unprecedented prosperity at the turn of the century. They had built their system on certain assumptions about how power should be distributed and exercised, and they understood Roosevelt to threaten those assumptions. Yet from the opposite direction came different hopes. Reformers looked at Roosevelt's vigorous temperament and saw in it the possibility of redemption. Perhaps, they thought, his energy could be redirected toward more progressive purposes. Perhaps he could refashion the Republican Party into something closer to what it had been under Abraham Lincoln, a force genuinely concerned with spreading prosperity beyond the narrow circle of the wealthy to reach the common man. These competing hopes and fears swirled around the new president as he settled into his office. Roosevelt himself carried within him the tensions that produced both reactions. Throughout his career, he had struggled to reconcile competing impulses, his genuine allegiance to the Republican Party as the instrument of his political ambitions, and his conviction that that same party had become captured by reactionaries who feared progressive change. He considered himself conservative in relation to the populists and the more radical elements of American politics. Yet he believed his own party was itself infected with a paralyzing dread of radicalism that prevented it from addressing genuine social problems. The men who dominated Congress in both chambers, as he saw it, were precisely such fearful conservatives, men who distrusted anything that was progressive. These observations were not abstract or theoretical. Roosevelt had come to understand, through his years in public life, that progress would not come through quiet appeals to established power. The forces arrayed against change were too entrenched, too comfortable in their arrangements. What would be required instead was a direct appeal to the people themselves, those whom he thought of as the masters of both of us, the ultimate source of authority in a democratic system. To reach the general public, to mobilize their support for his purposes, he would need to enlist the new breed of independent journalists who had begun to make themselves felt in American life. He recognized, even at the beginning of his presidency, that without the active support of these writers and editors, he would have been powerless. This understanding marked an important evolution in Roosevelt's thinking about executive power. It was not enough to control the machinery of government. One must also control the narrative through which the public understood what government was doing. The press represented both a tool and a constraint. Handled properly cultivated and directed, journalists could become conduits for presidential purpose, but they could also, if they chose to do so, expose and criticize executive action. Managing this relationship would become one of the central preoccupations of his presidency. He would maintain friendly relations with Japan. Roosevelt grew concerned about Japanese expansion, particularly after Japan's victory over Russia. He came to believe that Japan represented a potential threat to American interests in the Pacific. To counter this threat, Roosevelt embarked upon a strategy of maintaining naval superiority in the Pacific through the Great White Fleet, a naval demonstration that would display American power to the world. In 1907, Roosevelt ordered the Great White Fleet, 16 battleships painted white, along with supporting vessels, to sail around the world. The fleet departed Hampton Roads, Virginia, in December 1907, and returned in February 1909, visiting numerous ports and demonstrating American naval capability. The voyage was partly intended as a show of strength directed at Japan, though Roosevelt maintained the official position that it was a peaceful demonstration of American naval prowess. The fleet's world tour served multiple purposes. It tested American naval readiness, allowed officers and men to gain practical experience, and conveyed to other world powers, particularly Japan, that the United States possessed formidable military resources. Roosevelt also sought to resolve tensions with Japan through diplomacy. The Root-Takahira Agreement of 1908, negotiated by Secretary of State Elihu Root and Japanese Ambassador Takahira Kogoro, represented an effort to stabilize relations between the two nations. Under the agreement, both powers pledged to maintain the status quo in the Pacific, respect each other's territorial possessions, and uphold the open-door policy in China. Though the agreement was somewhat ambiguous in its language and left room for different interpretations, it reflected Roosevelt's desire to manage great power relations through negotiated settlements rather than military confrontation. Roosevelt believed that a balance of power in the Pacific, with the United States maintaining naval superiority, would preserve peace and prevent Japanese domination of the region. The question of Japanese immigration to the United States presented another arena for Roosevelt's diplomatic efforts. Tensions had arisen on the West Coast, particularly in California, where white workers and political leaders resented Japanese immigration and competition for jobs. In 1906, San Francisco's school board had attempted to segregate Japanese students, which provoked outrage in Japan and threatened to create a serious diplomatic crisis. Roosevelt intervened to prevent further escalation of the conflict. He pressured the San Francisco school board to rescind the segregation order and simultaneously negotiated what became known as the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. Under this informal understanding, Japan agreed to voluntarily restrict emigration of its laborers to the United States, while America pledged not to enact discriminatory legislation against Japanese immigrants. The agreement, while avoiding explicit legislation, accomplished Roosevelt's goal of reducing tensions between the two nations while addressing the concerns of California's white population. It represented a pragmatic compromise that reflected Roosevelt's understanding that foreign policy required balancing competing domestic interests with international considerations. China and the open-door Caucasus. Roosevelt's approach to China reflected his broader strategic vision for East Asia. He supported the open-door policy, which sought to ensure that all nations would have equal trading access to China, and that China's territorial integrity would be preserved. The Boxer Rebellion of 1899–1901, which had erupted in response to foreign encroachment on Chinese sovereignty, had been suppressed by an international force that included American troops. Roosevelt worried that the great powers might use the rebellion's aftermath as an opportunity to partition China among themselves. He sought to prevent such a partition and to maintain China as a unified nation where American commercial interests could operate on equal terms with those of other nations. However, Roosevelt was also realistic about China's weakness and the limits of American power to protect it. He did not believe that the United States could or should attempt to maintain China's independence through military force alone. Rather, he hoped that by maintaining a naval presence in the Pacific and by promoting the open-door policy, the United States could discourage aggressive action by other powers and preserve space for American interests. He recognized that Japan, being the dominant regional power in East Asia, might ultimately play a significant role in determining China's fate. This recognition informed his efforts to maintain friendly relations with Japan and to establish clear boundaries regarding each nation's sphere of influence in the region. Roosevelt's realism about China's prospects contrasted with the more idealistic views of some American missionaries and reformers who hoped that American influence would transform China into a modern, democratic nation. Roosevelt respected missionary efforts, but did not believe that moral suasion or missionary work alone could overcome the fundamental challenges of Chinese politics and society. He focused instead on protecting American economic and strategic interests, while acknowledging the reality that China faced significant internal and external pressures that were largely beyond American capacity to resolve. Latin America and the Roosevelt corollary circles. Roosevelt's foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere was animated by the conviction that the United States had both the right and the responsibility to intervene in the affairs of Latin American nations. He viewed this role as an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, which had warned European powers against interference in the Americas. But Roosevelt's formulation went considerably further. In what became known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, he asserted that if Latin American nations failed to maintain order and meet their international obligations, the United States would intervene to restore stability and prevent European intervention. As he articulated the principle, chronic wrongdoing, or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, may in America, as elsewhere, require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, to the exercise of an international police power. This doctrine represented a significant expansion of American power in the region. It justified American intervention not merely to prevent European encroachment, but to impose order and good governance on Latin American states, according to American standards. The Roosevelt corollary was informed by Roosevelt's social Darwinist beliefs. His conviction that strong nations had a duty to control weaker ones, and his belief that American civilization and institutions were superior to those of Latin American republics. Roosevelt implemented this doctrine most dramatically in Panama. In 1903, He supported Panamanian independence from Colombia, which he saw as an obstacle to the construction of an Isthmian canal. After Panama achieved independence, Roosevelt moved quickly to negotiate the Haybunau-Varilla Treaty, which granted the United States rights to construct and control the Panama Canal. The canal was Roosevelt's greatest pride among his foreign policy achievements. He believed it would revolutionize global commerce and strengthen American naval power by eliminating the need for ships to sail around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. The canal also represented, in Roosevelt's view, the triumph of American will and engineering prowess. He was personally invested in the canal's success and took an unusually active interest in its construction, even visiting the site in 1906, the first sitting president to travel outside the continental United States while in office. Roosevelt's intervention in Panama reflected his belief that the United States had the right and duty to reshape the political geography of the Western Hemisphere according to its strategic interests. The Panamanian people, though grateful for independence from Colombia, soon found themselves constrained by the terms of American control over the Canal Zone and by American dominance in their national affairs. Roosevelt did not view this as problematic. He believed that American presence would bring civilization, order, and progress to the region. Roosevelt applied similar logic to other Latin American interventions. When the Dominican Republic faced fiscal instability and the threat of European intervention to collect debts, Roosevelt took control of Dominican customs houses in 1905. American officials would collect Dominican revenues and allocate portions to service the nation's foreign debts, while the remainder would go to the Dominican government. This arrangement, known as the Dominican Customs Receivership, exemplified Roosevelt's willingness to subordinate Latin American sovereignty to what he perceived as the requirements of hemispheric stability and American security. It also demonstrated his belief that financial and administrative control could be exercised without formal colonization. In Cuba, where American intervention during the Spanish-American War had resulted in formal independence, Roosevelt maintained American dominance through the Platt Amendment, which had been inserted into the Cuban Constitution and gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to preserve independence and maintain order. When Cuban political instability threatened in 1906, Roosevelt authorized American military occupation. Though the occupation lasted only a few years, it reinforced Cuban dependence on American power and demonstrated the limits of Cuban sovereignty. Roosevelt's Latin American policy generated both admiration and resentment. Admirers saw him as a statesman who prevented European intervention, maintained regional stability, and promoted American interests. Critics, particularly in Latin America, viewed his actions as imperialism, dressed in the language of civilization and order. The Roosevelt corollary would eventually be repudiated by later American administrations, but during Roosevelt's presidency, it represented the fullest expression of his conviction that American power must be exercised globally to shape international affairs according to American interests and values. President and Conservationist. President and Conservationist, the momentum of foreign policy and imperial assertion that had carried Roosevelt through his early presidency, the demonstrations of American naval power, the careful choreography of global influence, the patient construction of a hemispheric order, all of this constituted one current of his administration. But it was not the whole river, quieter than the thunder of battleships or the drama of diplomatic intervention, yet perhaps closer to what occupied Roosevelt's deepest convictions, ran a different stream of work. It concerned not the control of nations, but the preservation of things that had no voice in the councils of men: the ancient forests, the wild creatures, the stone monuments of forgotten ages. In the conservation of natural resources and the extension of federal protection to land and wildlife, Roosevelt found a kind of work that seemed to touch something essential in himself, something that did not require the performance of vigor or the assertion of dominance, but rather a kind of stewardship that could outlast his own years. He worked closely in this endeavor with two men whose names would become nearly inseparable from his own in this domain: James Rudolph Garfield, who served as Secretary of the Interior, and Gifford Pinchot, the Chief of the United States Forest Service. These partnerships had the character of genuine intellectual and moral alignment, where Roosevelt so often dominated those around him through force of will or personality. With Garfield and Pinchot, he seemed to meet equals in conviction. Men who understood without lengthy explanation what he wished to accomplish. Together they moved to enact a series of conservation programs, though not without resistance. Western Congress members, such as Charles William Fulton, viewed these initiatives with something approaching alarm, seeing in them a threat to the development and exploitation of lands within their constituencies. But Roosevelt, once his mind was set on a matter, moved with patience and determination. The establishment of the United States Forest Service itself represented a formalization of what had been attempted piecemeal before. Under his authority, Roosevelt signed into being 5 national parks, landscapes set aside in perpetuity, removed from the market for private gain. In 1906, he signed the Antiquities Act, a piece of legislation that granted him the executive power to proclaim national monuments without requiring congressional approval. This proved to be a tool of considerable consequence. Using this authority, Roosevelt proclaimed 18 new United States national monuments. His vision extended further still. He established the first 51 bird reserves, created 4 game preserves, and designated 150 national forests. When all these protections were tallied, the forests, the parks, the monuments, the refuges for creatures, the land encompassed approximated 230 million acres. It was a vast estate claimed not for settlement or extraction, but for preservation, a silent argument about what the nation ought to hold in trust. Roosevelt's method for accomplishing this work revealed something essential about how he understood power. He did not always wait for Congress to act, nor did he accept limitations Congress sought to place upon him. He relied extensively on executive orders, a tool that, in his hands, became almost an instrument of conservation itself. These orders could be issued swiftly, without the delays of legislative negotiation, and they left little room for compromise. By the end of his second term, Roosevelt had used executive orders to reserve 150 million acres of forestry land. This represented an astonishing assertion of presidential authority, and it did not escape notice. Congress, or at least that portion of Congress concerned about executive overreach, began to bridle. Senator Charles Fulton, who had opposed Roosevelt's conservation efforts from the beginning, eventually succeeded in attaching an amendment to an agricultural appropriations bill that forbade the president from reserving further land. But Roosevelt, understanding the moment before the amendment took effect, moved with a kind of deliberate haste. Before he signed the bill into law, he established 21 additional forest reserves. It was a move that embodied something characteristic of him, a willingness to test the boundaries of his own authority, to push forward up to the very edge of what was legally permissible, even knowing it would provoke opposition. In total, across his presidency, Roosevelt had established 121 forest reserves in 31 states through the use of executive orders alone. When set against the records of his predecessors, the scale of this action becomes apparent. Roosevelt issued 1,081 executive orders over the course of his presidency, more than any president before him, except for Grover Cleveland, who had issued 253. The first 25 presidents of the United States, combined, had issued only 1,262 executive orders. In this single measure of executive will, Roosevelt had nearly doubled the accumulated precedent of all his forebears. Yet he was unrepentant about this expansion of power. When Congress protested that he was encroaching on too many lands, Roosevelt did not argue that he was staying within strict constitutional bounds, nor did he apologize. Instead, he seemed to regard the criticism as irrelevant. The lands needed protection. He had the authority to provide it. The matter was simple. It was the same logic that had guided his foreign policy, the same conviction that power, when wielded by those who understood its proper uses, was an instrument of righteousness. One can note without contradiction that in domestic conservation, this logic produced results that later generations would view with gratitude, while in foreign intervention, it had produced effects more ambiguous and troubling. This conservation work, moreover, reflected something that appeared nowhere else in his presidency, with quite the same clarity, a kind of humility before nature itself. Roosevelt did not believe that the forests and creatures of America were his to do with as he wished. Rather, he believed they were held in trust, not even by himself or his generation, but for generations not yet born. He became the first honorary member of the Camp Fire Club of America, a distinction that acknowledged his standing not as a ruler of nature, but as one who had earned the respect of those who understood the wild, with the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from time spent within it. The same period that witnessed this conservation effort also saw Roosevelt grappling with an acute economic crisis that threatened the stability of the nation's financial system. In 1907, the stock market entered a slump in its early months. Wall Street investors, who had watched with a mixture of appreciation and alarm as Roosevelt implemented his regulatory policies, began to attribute the decline in stock prices to these very measures. There was a logic to their concern. The new regulations, the prosecutions of trusts, the restrictions placed on railroad practices, all of this created uncertainty, made the future less predictable. In the minds of those accustomed to a certain freedom of action, this uncertainty itself was a species of danger. The crisis deepened as the autumn months approached. Roosevelt, observing the tightening of credit and the spreading anxiety, understood that action was required. In November, he authorized a meeting with the leaders of United States Steel, among the most powerful industrial figures in the nation. On November 4th, 1907, Roosevelt approved their plan to purchase a Tennessee steel company that faced imminent bankruptcy. The acquisition itself was straightforward enough, one large concern purchasing another in a moment of distress. But the political and financial significance was considerable. The failure of the Tennessee company would have precipitated the collapse of a major New York bank, with consequences that would have rippled through the entire financial system. By sanctioning the purchase, Roosevelt had implicitly protected not merely a company, but the structure of credit and confidence upon which the entire economy rested. Yet this action, sensible though it appeared in the moment of crisis, placed Roosevelt in an awkward position. Only months before, in August, he had delivered a major speech titled The Puritan Spirit and the Regulation of Corporations, in which he had exploded in anger at what he termed the malefactors of great wealth. He had, in that speech, blamed the spreading financial distress partly on the determination of his government to punish certain wealthy men for their economic malfeasance. He had suggested, with apparent earnestness, that these men had deliberately engineered financial stress in order to discredit his regulatory policies and force their reversal. The speech had been fierce in its denunciation, moral in its language, almost apocalyptic in its vision of a great struggle between the forces of decency and a parasitic class of the wealthy. The substance of what he said in that speech deserves attention, for it reveals the shape of his thinking about wealth and power in the industrial age. After saluting the unbending rectitude of the Puritans, he had continued, "It may well be that the determination of the government to punish certain malefactors of great wealth has been responsible for something of the trouble, at least to the extent of having caused these men to combine to bring about as much financial stress as possible in order to discredit the policy of the government and thereby secure a reversal of that policy, so that they may enjoy unmolested the fruits of their own evil doing." The accusation contained its own logic that the wealthy, feeling threatened by regulation, had weaponized financial crisis itself, had deliberately created hardship for the nation in order to restore their own freedom of action. It was a striking claim, one that ascribed to the wealthy a kind of coordinated malevolence. Whether such coordination actually existed, or whether Roosevelt believed it existed, or whether he was speaking rhetorically in order to shape public opinion, remains a matter that historians have not entirely settled. What is beyond dispute is that, in private, Roosevelt's disdain for the wealthy classes was profound and personal. Among his papers and recorded conversations, one finds remarks of a vehemence that the public speeches only hinted at. He privately scorned what he characterized as the entire unfitness to govern the country displayed by the very rich, and he condemned the lasting damage they do by much of what they think are the legitimate big business operations of the day. This private rancor gives a different color to his public actions. When he approved the acquisition by United States Steel, was he betraying his own principles, or was he demonstrating a kind of pragmatism, a recognition that in moments of crisis, even an imperfect action was preferable to the chaos of inaction? The question troubled contemporaries and has troubled historians since. Of the infection, and he was running a high fever. Roosevelt was ravaged by illness, but refused to turn back, insisting the expedition must continue. He remarked to Cherry that he was merely a crippled man going to his last camp. Yet his determination persisted, and the party pressed forward through the Brazilian wilderness. The expedition faced rapids, hostile encounters with indigenous peoples, and the constant threat of disease. Roosevelt lost considerable weight, and his health deteriorated further, but he remained resolute in his scientific mission. The journey down the river proved treacherous in ways the party had not fully anticipated. Food supplies dwindled as they descended into uncharted territory. Several members of the expedition fell ill, and 2 of the Brazilian camaradas died during the ordeal. Roosevelt's condition worsened alongside these mounting difficulties, yet he continued to document observations and collect specimens. The illness that had seized him seemed relentless, sapping his legendary vigor. When finally the party emerged from the wilderness in April 1914, Roosevelt had been transformed by the ordeal. He had lost some 50 pounds and was a shadow of the robust figure who had entered the jungle months before. The Roosevelt River, as it came to be named in his honor, represented a fitting capstone to his life of exploration and adventure. The expedition generated considerable scientific material, and Roosevelt would later publish his account in Through the Brazilian Wilderness, which detailed both the wonders and perils of the South American interior. The book demonstrated that even in his post-presidential years, Roosevelt remained driven by the same impulses toward discovery and masculine challenge that had defined his earlier life. His willingness to endure such hardship at an age when most men would have sought comfort spoke to something fundamental in his character, an inability to accept diminishment or domesticity. Yet the South American expedition also marked something else, a turning point toward the final chapter of Roosevelt's public life. When he returned to the United States in the spring of 1914, the nation was beginning to grapple with the reality of the Great War in Europe. The continent that he had toured with such diplomatic ceremony 5 years earlier was now tearing itself apart. Roosevelt had long warned against what he saw as American complacency in the face of international conflict. He had argued that neutrality was a form of cowardice, that nations had moral obligations to support the forces of civilization against barbarism. The war in Europe seemed to vindicate every argument he had made about the necessity of military preparedness and the dangers of pacifism. Roosevelt's voice, which had been somewhat muted during the Taft years and his African and South American travels, now rose again with characteristic force. He began writing articles and giving speeches denouncing President Wilson's neutrality policy. The president's repeated assurances that he had kept us out of war struck Roosevelt as not merely inadequate, but morally wrong. In Roosevelt's view, the United States had a civilizational duty to stand with Britain and France against the German Empire. This conviction would consume much of his attention during the final years before American entry into the war in 1917. The contrast between Roosevelt's worldview and Wilson's could hardly have been starker. Where Wilson spoke of peace without victory and a League of Nations that might transcend the old balance of power politics, Roosevelt scorned such idealism as naive and dangerous. Where Wilson counseled patience and diplomatic negotiation, Roosevelt demanded military preparation and moral clarity about American interests. Roosevelt's arguments were not merely political calculations, though certainly political considerations played a role. He genuinely believed that some things, honor, civilization, the balance of power, were worth fighting for, that a nation unwilling to fight for its principles was a nation in moral decline. This conviction had deep roots in Roosevelt's understanding of history and human nature. He was a student of military affairs, had written extensively on naval history, and believed that great powers had always been shaped by their willingness to use force in pursuit of national objectives. The romanticization of war that characterized much of his thought was not uncommon among men of his generation and class. But in Roosevelt, it was particularly intense and philosophically articulated. He had read Clausewitz and Mahan. He understood warfare as an instrument of statecraft. But he also believed, in ways that went beyond mere strategic calculation, that war tested and ennobled national character. In the months and years following his return from South America, Roosevelt became increasingly critical of what he saw as the Wilson administration's failures. He faulted the president for inadequate military preparedness, for failing to protest German submarine warfare with sufficient vigor, and for allowing American interests to be trampled by the great powers locked in combat. When finally, in April 1917, the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies, Roosevelt felt vindicated. Yet even in vindication, he found cause for frustration. At an age when he might have expected to lead, Roosevelt found himself sidelined. President Wilson refused to appoint him to any significant role in the war effort, and when Roosevelt sought to raise a volunteer division to fight in France. The request was denied. The aging ex-president, denied the opportunity to serve actively, had to content himself with writing and speaking in support of the war effort. His sons, however, played active roles. Kermit served in the British Army before transferring to the American Expeditionary Forces. Quentin, his youngest son, became a pilot in the Army Air Service. In July 1918, Quentin was shot down and killed in aerial combat in France. The loss devastated Roosevelt, though he bore it with the stoicism he had always preached. He had taught his sons that duty and honor were paramount, that a man's measure was taken by his willingness to sacrifice. Quentin's death was the price of those convictions. The final years of Roosevelt's life were shadowed by grief and declining health. The tropical fever he had contracted in South America had left lasting damage to his constitution. The strain of the war, the loss of his son, and the disappointments of his post-presidential years all took their toll. Yet Roosevelt remained engaged with public affairs until the end. He continued to write, to speak, and to involve himself in Republican Party politics. When the war ended in November 1918, Roosevelt could claim that events had proven him right about American responsibilities in the world. The League of Nations that Wilson championed was, in Roosevelt's view, an inadequate instrument for maintaining global order. He argued instead for a return to the clear-eyed realism about power that he had always advocated. The conservation work that Roosevelt had undertaken as president was another source of pride in his later years, though he had little direct involvement in forestry policy after leaving office. The lands he had protected remained under federal protection, a lasting legacy of his belief that the natural heritage of the nation belonged to all Americans and must be preserved for future generations. When he spoke of his presidency, he frequently returned to his conservation accomplishments, suggesting that he believed this work would outlast the political controversies and policy disputes that had marked his administration. In a sense, Roosevelt understood that protecting the Grand Canyon or setting aside national forests was a form of statesmanship that transcended partisan politics. Yet conservation, for all its importance, was not what consumed Roosevelt's final years. Rather, it was the question of American power and American duty in a transformed world. The Great War had destroyed the European balance of power that had existed since Napoleon. New powers were rising, old empires were collapsing, revolutionary ideologies were spreading. Roosevelt believed that the United States, having reluctantly entered the war and having contributed to the Allied victory, bore a special responsibility for shaping the peace. He rejected Wilson's vision of a league based on collective security and mutual guarantees. Instead, he envisioned a world in which the great powers, including the United States, would frankly acknowledge their spheres of influence and would cooperate to maintain order against threats to civilization. This worldview, rooted in Roosevelt's understanding of history and his reading of international relations theorists, represented a form of realism that would resurface in American foreign policy in later decades. Roosevelt had rejected the idealism of the peace movements and the optimism of those who believed that international law and disarmament could prevent war. He had instead emphasized the primacy of national interest and the necessity of power. That such views might seem cynical or amoral to those who believed in the progressive potential of international institutions did not trouble him. Roosevelt believed that morality in international affairs had to be grounded in reality, that noble intentions unsupported by force were not merely useless, but dangerous. In his final years, Roosevelt moved further from the Republican Party mainstream. The party had become more conservative, more protectionist, and less inclined toward the progressive reforms that Roosevelt had championed. Yet, he remained a Republican, unable to bring himself to abandon the party even when it seemed to have abandoned the principles he held dear. His ambivalence about party politics reflected a deeper ambivalence about the American political system itself. He believed in democracy and popular sovereignty, yet he also believed that the masses needed guidance from their betters, from men of character and education, who understood the complexities of statecraft and the demands of civilization. Final Years and Legacy. Chapter 4. Final Years and Legacy. In his final years, Roosevelt moved further from the Republican Party mainstream. The party had become more conservative, more protectionist, and less inclined toward the progressive reforms that Roosevelt had championed. Yet he remained a Republican, unable to bring himself to abandon the party even when it seemed to have abandoned the principles he held dear. His ambivalence about party politics reflected a deeper ambivalence about the American political system itself. He believed in democracy and popular sovereignty. Yet, he also believed that the masses needed guidance from their betters, from men of character and education, who understood the complexities of statecraft and the demands of civilization. The elections of 1910 had brought such disappointment. Roosevelt had campaigned vigorously for the Republican ticket, but the voters had turned decisively toward the Democrats, who gained control of the House for the first time since 1892. Among the newly elected was a distant cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, a New York State senator, who had argued that he represented Theodore's own progressive policies better than his Republican opponent, a claim that must have stung with its suggestion of betrayal. The defeat galvanized the Republican progressives, who interpreted the results as proof that their party required thorough reorganization. In 1911, Senator Robert M. La Follette joined with Gifford Pinchot, William White, and California Governor Hiram Johnson to establish the National Progressive Republican League. Their stated objective, nothing less than the destruction of political bossism at the state level and the replacement of President Taft at the national one. Roosevelt approached the League with skepticism, yet he could not entirely dismiss it. Between January and April of 1911, he contributed articles to The Outlook, a magazine to which he served as editor, and through which he maintained his weekly access to a large and educated national audience. In these pieces, he defended what he called the great movement of our day, the progressive nationalist movement against special privilege and in favor of an honest and efficient political and industrial democracy. The words flowed from his pen with familiar conviction, yet there remained in him a reluctance to take direct action, a hesitation that spoke to the tangle of his own uncertainties. He professed no interest in running for the presidency in 1912. Let others carry the standard. La Follette, undeterred by Roosevelt's apparent passivity, declared his own candidacy in June 1911, and for a time it seemed the question might be settled. But the break between Roosevelt and Taft, which had been widening since the 1910 elections, hardened into something irreparable in September of that year. The Justice Department filed an antitrust lawsuit against United States Steel, and in doing so, it challenged an acquisition that Roosevelt himself had personally approved during his own presidency. The humiliation ran deep. Here was the sitting president, the man Roosevelt had chosen as his successor, now undoing decisions Roosevelt had made in good faith. now implying through legal action that those decisions had been mistaken or worse. Roosevelt's criticism of Taft intensified, becoming public and unmistakable. Yet even in his anger, even in the face of what felt like betrayal, Roosevelt could not quite bring himself to announce his own candidacy. He clung to the possibility of waiting until 1916, of running then against whichever Democrat had defeated Taft in 1912. This, too, was an illusion he would soon have to relinquish. The question of arbitration and international peace became, in these years, an unexpected arena for Roosevelt's deepest convictions about statecraft and human nature. Taft and his Secretary of State, Philander C. Knox, had negotiated treaties with Britain and France in 1911, providing for the arbitration of differences between nations. All disputes were to be submitted to the Hague Court or another tribunal. These agreements, signed in August 1911, required a 2/3 Senate majority for ratification, a threshold that proved impossible to reach. Neither Taft nor Knox had consulted with Senate leaders during negotiations, a political oversight that would cost them dearly. Taft made speeches supporting the treaties in October, but he felt too politically weakened to lobby aggressively on their behalf, fearful that such efforts might guarantee their defeat. The Senate amended the treaties beyond recognition, and Taft could not accept the changes. The treaties died. But the arbitration question revealed something more significant than a mere political defeat. It exposed a fundamental fault line running through the progressive movement itself, splitting it into two opposed philosophical camps. One faction, led by Taft, and supported by a conservative business community that believed deeply in peace movements, looked to arbitration as the best possible alternative to the horror of warfare. Taft, as a constitutional lawyer, understood the legal intricacies involved. The businessmen who backed him believed that economic interdependence had made war prohibitively expensive, that trade and mutual profit had created a world too interconnected for nations to afford open conflict. Their vision was rational, commercial, and optimistic about human nature. Roosevelt's vision was something else entirely. He ridiculed arbitration as foolhardy idealism, a naive faith in the ability of words and legal procedure to settle matters that could only be decided by force. Roosevelt worked closely with his friend Senator Henry Cabot Lodge to impose amendments that destroyed the treaties. And in this work there was more than mere political sabotage of Taft's campaign promises. At a deeper level, Roosevelt truly believed that arbitration was a fundamentally mistaken approach, that great issues between nations had to be decided by war, that conflict itself possessed an ennobling character that compromise could never achieve. The Rooseveltian philosophy incorporated something almost mystical in its faith in war's elevating power. It endorsed a kind of jingoistic nationalism that stood in sharp opposition to the businessmen's calculation of profit and rational national interest. Where they saw economics, he saw virtue. Where they saw exchange, he saw struggle. These convictions about international affairs were not merely abstract for Roosevelt. He had spent his adult life contemplating the world's great questions, and in his final years, his thinking on these matters had crystallized into something fixed and unyielding. The events of the next several years would test these beliefs in ways he could not have anticipated. But the essential framework was already in place. He had moved, in his thinking about international law and institutions, far away from those who believed that such mechanisms could prevent war. He had instead emphasized the primacy of national interest and the necessity of power. That such views might seem cynical or immoral to those who believed in the progressive potential of international institutions did not trouble him. Roosevelt believed that morality in international affairs had to be grounded in reality, that noble intentions unsupported by force were not merely useless, but dangerous, worse than useless, in fact, because they bred a false security that made nations unprepared for the conflicts that inevitably came. His expedition to Africa and Europe in 1909 and 1910 had refreshed him, had allowed him to step away from the domestic political arena and pursue the work that had always sustained him, the study of nature, the hunting of rare creatures, the gathering of knowledge about the world. In March 1909, well financed by Andrew Carnegie and by the sales of his own writings, Roosevelt had departed for the Smithsonian Roosevelt African Expedition. His party landed at Mombasa in East Africa and travelled through the Belgian Congo before following the Nile River northward to Khartoum in what is now Sudan. The journey was extensive and purposeful. Roosevelt's group, led by the hunter-tracker R.J. Cunningham and including the famous big game hunter Frederick Selous, also numbered scientists from the Smithsonian Institution and the American Museum of Natural History. His son Kermit accompanied him, as did Edgar Alexander Mearns, Edmund Heller, and John Alden Loring. The work was meticulous and thorough. Over the course of the expedition, the team killed or trapped some 11,400 animals, from insects and small creatures to great hippopotamuses and elephants. Among the larger specimens, they secured 1,000 animals, including 512 big game animals and 6 rare white rhinos. Tons of salted carcasses and skins were packed and shipped back to Washington, where they would require years to mount and prepare for display. Roosevelt defended the scale of the hunt with characteristic directness. I can be condemned only if the existence of the National Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, and all similar zoological institutions are to be condemned, he said. The logic was his own. If one approved of such institutions, one could not condemn the means by which they obtained their specimens. He wrote a detailed and absorbing account of the expedition in his book African Game Trails, recording for readers the wonders and dangers of the African wilderness with the narrative skill that had made him a prolific and successful author. From Africa, Roosevelt traveled northward to Europe, embarking on a tour that would take him through the capitals and courts of the continent. He stopped first in Egypt, where he commented favorably on British rule, stating his view that Egypt was not yet ready for independence. He refused a meeting with the Pope due to a dispute involving a group of Methodists active in Rome, a small but characteristic act of principle. He met with the great figures of European power, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, King George V of Great Britain, and other leaders of the continent. In Oslo, he delivered a speech that outlined his vision of a peaceful world order, calling for limitations on naval armaments, a strengthening of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and the creation of what he termed a League of Peace among the world powers. At Oxford, he delivered the Romanes lecture, in which he denounced those who sought to draw parallels between the evolution of animal life and the development of human society, a position that revealed both his scientific interests and his concern with the misuse of evolutionary theory for political purposes. Though Roosevelt attempted to avoid entanglement in domestic American politics during this European sojourn, he nevertheless found time to meet quietly with Gifford Pinchot, his longtime ally and friend. Pinchot related to him his bitter disappointment with the Taft administration. The Interior Secretary, Richard Ballinger, had clashed with Pinchot over conservation policy, and Pinchot had been forced to resign from his position as head of the Forest Service. The news could only have reinforced Roosevelt's growing sense that the administration that had succeeded him was not merely disappointing, but actively hostile to the principles he had advanced. In June 1910, Roosevelt returned to the United States, his body refreshed by travel, but his mind increasingly preoccupied with the political situation he faced at home. There was one more adventure in store for him, one final expedition that would test his physical endurance and his capacity for suffering in ways even the African journey had not. But before that journey lay the complications of American politics in the election year of 1912, a struggle that would split the Republican Party and change the political landscape of the nation forever. Upon his return to American soil in May 1914, Roosevelt found a nation and a political landscape transformed by the years of his absence. Though he had attempted to remain aloof from domestic concerns during his travels abroad, the currents of American politics had shifted decisively in directions that troubled him deeply. His immediate preoccupation was with the Wilson administration's handling of the Panama Canal question, an issue that touched upon matters of national honor and American prestige. The administration's conclusion of a treaty that expressed what Roosevelt regarded as an insufficiently proud statement, one of mere sincere regret for the manner in which the United States had acquired the Panama Canal zone, struck him as a betrayal of sorts, a weakening of the nation's bearing on the world stage. Yet even as he registered this objection, he found himself compelled to acknowledge that many of the reforms advanced by President Wilson and his Democratic Congress possessed merit and aligned with principles he himself had championed. The ambivalence was uncomfortable, forcing Roosevelt to contemplate a political world that had not stood still in his absence, but had continued to evolve along lines he had helped to initiate. The elections of 1914 presented Roosevelt with what he perceived as an opportunity to reclaim leadership of the progressive movement that had fractured after his presidency. The Progressive Party, the organization he had helped to found and which had drawn so many Republicans into its ranks, still existed and still commanded the loyalty of millions who believed in the cause of reform. Roosevelt made campaign appearances on behalf of progressive candidates, lending his still formidable prestige and oratorical gifts to their efforts. Yet the results proved deeply disappointing. The Progressive Party performed poorly at the polls, revealing that the movement had lost much of its earlier momentum and popular support. The 1914 elections were a disaster for what had become a fledgling third party, its aspirations of fundamental realignment having proved premature and ultimately fragile. The outcome forced Roosevelt to reconsider his political options with characteristic boldness. If the third party could not serve as his vehicle, Roosevelt began to contemplate whether he might not yet lead the Republican Party itself back toward the path of progressive reform. He began to envision another campaign for the presidency, this time with himself at the head of the Republican Party establishment rather than in opposition to it. Such a prospect required healing the breach that still separated him from many Conservative Party leaders who had remained hostile to his candidacy and suspicious of his intentions. These leaders, ensconced in the party machinery and commanding substantial resources, remained opposed to Roosevelt's return to power. Yet Roosevelt possessed an asset that neither time nor political defeat had diminished: his capacity to mobilize popular opinion and his appeal to the ordinary citizens who formed the Republican electorate. As the election of 1916 approached, Roosevelt and the progressive leadership sought to position themselves strategically to maximize their leverage over the Republican Party. In a move calculated to generate pressure for a Roosevelt nomination, the progressive leaders scheduled the 1916 Progressive National Convention to take place at precisely the same time as the 1916 Republican National Convention. This scheduling arrangement was designed to create a situation in which the Republicans would be forced to choose between nominating Roosevelt, thereby bringing the progressives back into the fold and uniting the party, or else watching the progressives proceed with their own convention and their own candidate, thus dividing the anti-democratic vote. It was a shrewd maneuver, one that demonstrated Roosevelt's continued mastery of political tactics and his understanding of how to apply pressure through the threat of a split ticket. When the Republicans met in convention, however, they proved resistant to the pressure. The party chose instead to nominate Charles Evans Hughes, a distinguished jurist and former governor of New York, who represented a more conservative posture than Roosevelt represented. The nomination was a rebuke to Roosevelt's faction, though it was delivered without the overt hostility of earlier years. Faced with this outcome, Roosevelt confronted a choice that revealed much about his ultimate priorities. He declined the Progressive Party's nomination for president, declining to head the party's own separate ticket. Instead, he urged his progressive followers to support Hughes, the Republican nominee. This decision represented a significant retreat from the third-party experiment and a return to the orthodox Republican fold. That Roosevelt made this choice, despite his long-standing personal dislike of Hughes himself, speaks to the depth of his antagonism toward Woodrow Wilson. Whatever reservations Roosevelt harbored about Hughes, they paled beside his conviction that Wilson's presidency had been a disaster and that his continuation in office would constitute a genuine national calamity. Roosevelt campaigned with energy and passion on behalf of Hughes, traveling extensively and delivering speeches with the vigor that audiences had come to expect from him. Yet his efforts proved insufficient to turn the tide. The American electorate, still inclined toward the Democratic president who had kept them out of war, to invoke the campaign slogan, returned Wilson to office by a narrow margin. The result was decisive in its political implications. The Progressive Party, having declined to nominate its own candidate and having thrown its support behind Hughes without achieving victory, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent political force. It had served its purpose as a vehicle for discontent and reform sentiment, but it could not sustain itself indefinitely as a third party in the American system. In the aftermath of the 1916 defeat, Roosevelt and the vast majority of his followers rejoined the Republican Party, returning to the organization they had temporarily left and resuming their places within its councils. The entry of the United States into the First World War in April 1917 provided Roosevelt with a new arena for the exercise of his formidable energies and his deeply held convictions about American duty and national honor. From the moment war broke out in Europe in 1914, Roosevelt's sympathies had lain unambiguously with the Allied powers. He had become increasingly critical of what he regarded as Wilson's timidity and equivocation in the face of German aggression, particularly regarding submarine warfare and the treatment of neutral nations. As American ships fell victim to German submarines and American citizens perished in attacks on merchant vessels, Roosevelt's denunciations of the administration's foreign policy grew more strident. He called the president's approach a failure, particularly in light of German atrocities in Belgium and repeated violations of what Roosevelt conceived to be fundamental American rights. The sinking of the Lusitania had inflamed Roosevelt's anger, and he had mounted public campaigns demanding a more assertive American response. In the 1916 campaign, while supporting Hughes and delivering speeches on behalf of the Republican nominee, Roosevelt had taken the opportunity to articulate a vision of American national identity that reflected his growing concerns about the loyalty of hyphenated Americans. He repeatedly denounced what he called Irish Americans and German Americans, who appeared to him to be animated by divided loyalties, placing the interests of their ancestral homelands above their obligations to the United States. Roosevelt's position was emphatic and unforgiving. One had to be 100% American, not a hyphenated American who attempted to juggle multiple loyalties or to maintain primary attachments to foreign powers. This stance, reflecting the intensity of Roosevelt's nationalism and his conviction that the nation required unwavering devotion from all its citizens, would come to characterize much of his rhetoric during the war years. When Congress declared war on Germany in April 1917, Roosevelt's response was immediate and enthusiastic. More than that, he made clear his intention to contribute directly to the war effort through his physical presence and his influence with the public. In March of that year, even before the formal declaration of war, Congress had granted Roosevelt the authority to raise a maximum of 4 divisions, military units modeled on the organization and spirit of the Rough Riders he had led so famously in Cuba. Roosevelt, now in his late 50s but still possessed of substantial vigor and boundless energy, eagerly undertook the task of organizing these volunteer forces. He began recruiting and training men who would serve under his command in what promised to be a military adventure comparable to his experiences in the Spanish-American War. Yet, Roosevelt's plans encountered an unexpected obstacle in the person of President Wilson. The president, perhaps mindful of the political complications that would follow from allowing his most prominent Republican critic to achieve military glory on the fields of France, announced to the assembled press that he would not authorize the dispatch of Roosevelt and his volunteer divisions to France. Instead, Wilson declared the American forces would be organized under the traditional military command structure, with General John J. Pershing as the commanding officer of the American Expeditionary Forces. This decision represented a deliberate rejection of Roosevelt's offer and an assertion of presidential control over the conduct of the war. Roosevelt was stung by this rebuff, and he never forgave Wilson for what he regarded as a vindictive denial of the opportunity to serve his country in a military capacity. The disappointment of this rejection found expression in a book that Roosevelt published in the aftermath, titled The Foes of Our Own Household, an indictment of the Wilson administration's policies and leadership. The work gave voice to Roosevelt's conviction that the president had both mismanaged the war effort and had been driven by petty political considerations in denying him the chance to contribute his services to the nation's military cause. Yet even as Roosevelt vented his frustration in print, events were unfolding that would bring him a personal tragedy that dwarfed all political disappointments. Roosevelt's youngest son, Quentin, had followed his father's example and had pursued military service with enthusiasm. Quentin, only 20 years old, had enlisted as a pilot with the American forces in France, joining the air service and engaging in combat operations against the German Air Force. On July 14, 1918, Quentin's aircraft was shot down behind German lines. The young man, who possessed something of his father's adventurous spirit and reckless courage, was killed in the action. The loss struck Roosevelt with a force that transcended political defeat or personal disappointment. He never recovered fully from the death of his youngest son, and those who knew him well in his final years noted that the loss had fundamentally altered him. The grief of a father who had so celebrated courage and the strenuous life, but who had not anticipated being called upon to sacrifice his own child in pursuit of those ideals, was deep and enduring. Even in the midst of personal sorrow, however, Roosevelt continued to engage with the broader questions of world politics and international order that had preoccupied him since his youth. The war had been fought, in Roosevelt's understanding, not merely for national advantage, but for the creation of a just international order in which future wars might be prevented through mechanisms of collective security and arbitration. He had long been convinced that the great powers of the world needed to create formal structures through which disputes might be resolved without recourse to warfare, and he had articulated versions of this vision at various points in his career. In his Nobel Prize address of 1910, delivered when he was no longer president, but remained a figure of considerable international prominence, Roosevelt had suggested that the great powers honestly bent on peace should form a League of Peace, not only to keep the peace among themselves, but to prevent, by force if necessary, its being broken by others. He had envisioned such a league as possessing genuine executive power, authority that the existing Hague Conventions had lacked. He called for American participation in such an arrangement, convinced that the United States could not absent itself from the maintenance of world order. When the war had begun in 1914, Roosevelt had elaborated on these themes, proposing what he called a World League for the Peace of Righteousness. This league, as he conceived it, would preserve the sovereignty of individual nations, but would impose limitations on armaments, and would require that international disputes be submitted to arbitration. Yet Roosevelt added a crucial stipulation. It should be solemnly covenanted that if any nations refuse to abide by the decisions of such a court, then others draw the sword in behalf of peace and justice. In other words, the League would require that member nations be prepared to use military force against any nation that refused to submit to arbitration or that violated the rights of other nations. This combination of arbitration and collective enforcement represented Roosevelt's mature thinking about international organization. By 1915, as the war continued and the scope of its devastation became increasingly apparent, Roosevelt had outlined his plan in greater detail. He urged that the nations of the world guarantee to provide their entire military forces, if necessary, against any nation that refused to carry out the decrees of an international arbitration body or that violated the rights of other nations. Though Roosevelt harbored some concerns about the potential impact of such an arrangement on American sovereignty, he remained convinced that a League of Nations would only be effective if the United States participated fully as one of the joint guarantors of the system. He referred to this plan in a speech delivered in 1918 as the most feasible design for the establishment of a League of Nations. Roosevelt's vision of international organization stood in tension with the approach that President Wilson was developing during these same years. Wilson, who had initially been cool to the idea of American participation in a permanent international league, had come to embrace the concept as the war drew toward its conclusion. Yet Wilson's League of Nations, which emerged from the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, reflected a different philosophy from the one Roosevelt had articulated. Roosevelt denounced Wilson's approach, fearing that it lacked the enforcement mechanisms and the clear commitment to collective military action that he believed essential. Yet Roosevelt did not live to witness the final adoption of Wilson's League at Paris or the subsequent rejection of American membership by the Senate. Henry Cabot Lodge, Roosevelt's old friend and ally, remained willing to accept Wilson's League, though he harbored serious reservations about its provisions. In the end, Lodge's reservations proved significant, as the Senate refused to ratify the League Covenant without substantial modifications. On March 19, 1920, Wilson had Democratic senators vote against the League with the Lodge Reservations, ensuring that the United States would not join the organization. The irony was evident. The president who had articulated a vision of American participation in world organization had, through his inflexibility and his unwillingness to compromise with Senate Republicans, prevented American membership in the very institution he had championed. Throughout 1918 and into 1919, Roosevelt remained active in political life, though his physical condition was steadily deteriorating. His attacks on the Wilson administration and its policies had contributed to the Republican victories in the midterm elections of 1918, when the party recaptured control of Congress from the Democrats. New York Republicans approached Roosevelt with requests that he run for another gubernatorial term, a position he had held decades earlier in his rise to national prominence. Yet Roosevelt declined, having no interest in returning to a state office when larger questions of national and world politics demanded attention. He focused his efforts instead on the formulation of a program for the Republican Party that would embody the principles of progressive reform and vigorous nationalism that had always animated his political philosophy. Though his health was uncertain and those close to him recognized that he was weakening, Roosevelt was nonetheless seen by Republican leaders and party activists as a leading contender for the 1920 presidential nomination. He had made clear, however, that he would not modify his fundamental positions in order to secure the nomination. When asked to indicate whether he would accept the nomination under any circumstances, he responded with characteristic firmness, "If they take me, they'll have to take me, without a single modification of the things that I have always stood for." He wrote to William Allen White, the Kansas editor and progressive Republican, expressing his desire to do everything in my power to make the Republican Party the party of sane, constructive radicalism, just as it was under Lincoln. This vision of the party's future incorporated a distinctly progressive agenda. In an address delivered to the 1918 State Convention of the main Republican Party, Roosevelt articulated his support for a range of reform measures that reflected his mature political thinking. He stood for old age pensions, a protection for those too aged to work. He supported insurance for sickness and unemployment, mechanisms through which workers would be protected against the financial catastrophe of illness or the loss of employment. He advocated for the construction of public housing designed specifically for families with low incomes, believing that the state had an obligation to ensure adequate shelter for all citizens. He called for the reduction of working hours, convinced that workers deserved time for rest and leisure, and that such reductions would improve the conditions of labor. He urged aid to farmers, recognizing the struggles of agricultural communities, and he called for more comprehensive regulation of large corporations, maintaining his conviction that government must act as a restraining force on the power of concentrated wealth. This agenda, articulated at the end of his life, represented the fullest expression of Roosevelt's progressive convictions. It demonstrated that his commitment to reform had not diminished with age or changed in its essential character over the course of decades. Whether he might have secured the Republican nomination and won the presidency a third time remained an open question, one that history would not permit to be answered. Throughout 1918 and continuing into the early months of 1919, Roosevelt's physical condition deteriorated markedly. The long-term effects of the jungle diseases contracted during the South American expedition years earlier continued to plague him, manifesting in recurring bouts of fever and weakness that his physicians could not fully remedy. These afflictions, combined with the ordinary infirmities of advancing age and a body that had been subjected to decades of vigorous exertion, took an increasing toll. He was hospitalized for 7 weeks, a serious setback that made clear to all who knew him that his strength was not infinite. When he was released from the hospital, it became apparent that he would not achieve a full recovery from this illness. The vigor that had defined him, that had enabled him to pursue every sort of physical challenge and to maintain a schedule of activity that would have exhausted men half his age, was finally beginning to fade. Those closest to him understood that whatever time remained to him would not be lengthy. The end, when it came, arrived with the sudden finality that characterized so much of Roosevelt's life. On the night of January 5, 1919, Roosevelt suffered breathing difficulties that alarmed those who attended him. His physician, George W. Fowler, was summoned and rendered treatment, and Roosevelt seemed to improve with the attention. After receiving the ministrations of his doctor, he felt sufficiently restored to retire to bed. Those attending him believed that he would recover from this temporary crisis, as he had recovered from so many physical challenges throughout his life. Yet, on the morning of January 6, between 4 and 4:15, in the early hours before dawn, Roosevelt died in his sleep at his home at Sagamore Hill. The cause was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had lodged in his lungs and cut off the circulation that sustained his life. It was, perhaps, a fitting end for a man who had lived so fully and so intensely, to be taken suddenly in sleep rather than to linger in gradual decline. His last words, spoken to his family servant James E. Amos as the evening had deepened into night, were either "Please put out that light, James," or, as some accounts recorded it, "James, will you please put out the light?" Simple words, unhurried and calm, the final utterance of a man who had spent his life in motion, but who had come at last to rest. He was 60 years old. The American presidency had lasted for 7.5 years, a tenure that had transformed the office itself and had reshaped the relationship between the executive and the nation. His life beyond the presidency had been full of adventure, travel, writing, and continued engagement with the great questions of his time. Yet the sum of those accomplishments seemed inadequate to contain the energy and the presence that had characterized Theodore Roosevelt. Upon receiving word of his death, his son Archibald, who was serving in military uniform far from home, sent a telegram to his siblings. It contained only a few words, but they captured something essential about the man being eulogized. The old lion is dead.